Mr. William S. Holland came from Gary, Indiana. That's right, Mr. James G. Ryan paid for Mr. Holland to move him and his family down here to Houston, Texas, to be the first athletic director for the new Jack Yates in 1926. And when Mr. Ryan got sick, Mr. Holland came to be his assistant. And when Mr. Ryan passed in 1940, Mr. William Holland took over the principal job. But now, one thing about Mr. Holland, being from Gary, Indiana, which is the home of the Jackson 5, in case you want to know about Gary, Indiana. But Mr. Holland, he's the one who orchestrated the Turkey Day Classic when Mr. Ryan passed. He went and told the HISD school board that how much money HISD make when Yates would play weekly. See, the Turkey Day Classic is what it got to be, but when it started out, it was a Thanksgiving game, and they would rotate between Yates, Wheatley, and Booker T. But Mr. Holland knew and kept up with the figures because he knew about rivalries coming from Gary, Indiana. So he seen the big impact when Yates would play weekly. So therefore, he went and told HISD that they need to schedule it every Thanksgiving. Yates and Wheatley still rotating Booker T. Washington, because Booker T. Washington was right next door to Jack Yates, and Jack Yates was a new school, Phyllis Wheatley was a new school. So they was the two rivals, and plus Wheatley was on the north side and Jack Yates was on the south side. So that Mr. William S. Holland, is the one who orchestrated the Turkey Day Classic. And the Turkey Day Classic was the rivalry between Yates and Wheatley. But and his assistant, when he got to be a principal, he moved Mr. Dawson up, who he could trust to be his assistant principal. But Yates was getting so overcrowded because all the kids from 3rd Ward, all the kids in Sunnyside, because it wasn't no Worthing then. So all the kids from Sunnyside had to come to Yates. All the kids that lived out there in Harrisburg, they couldn't go to Milby because it was a white school, so they had to be bused to Jack Yates. And all the kids that was living out there in Piney Point in Southwest Houston, they could not go to Robert E. Lee, so they had to be bused to Jack Yates. So Jack Yates was well overcrowded. And Mr. Holland told them that they need to give the blacks a junior high school like they did out there in 5th Ward with E.O. Smith. So the Jewish and the white people were moving out of 3rd Ward, and Sidney Johnston was a junior high school out there for whites. So they took Sidney Johnson and took it out there to Braeswood, where the Jews and the white people were moving, and they turned it over to blacks. But they had to rename it. And Mr. William E. Miller was a real principal at Booker T. Washington. In fact, Mr. William E. Miller, he took over the principal job when Mr. James G. Ryan went and opened up Jack Yates in 1926. And therefore, they wanted to honor Mr. William E. Miller just like they honored, eventually, Mr. Ryan. But they honored Mr. Miller first because Miller opened up in 1957. And they named it after the former principal that used to be over there at Booker T. Washington. And the following year, in 1958, they opened up the second junior high school, which was called James G. Ryan. And James G. Ryan was the second junior high school. But when they opened up the new Yates at 3703 Sampson, they left Mr. Holland over there to the old Yates, which became James G. Ryan. A lot of blacks got upset because they felt like Mr. Ryan was, at least Mr. Holland was punished. But nevertheless, Mr. Holland was always a leader. And Mr. Holland orchestrated the rivalry between Yates and Wheatley, the Turkey Day Classic. And that's what he called it, the Turkey Day Classic. It was no longer the Thanksgiving game, it was called the Turkey Day Classic. And then when he got over there to Ryan in Mr. Dawson was his assistant for years after Mr. Ryan passed, and Mr. Dawson went to open up the new William E. Miller, so they started a rivalry between Ryan and Miller. And Mr. Holland also orchestrated and said, well, let's don't do a trophy, let's do a jug, a little brown jug. Let's call it the little brown jug. And that's where the name come from, Mr. William Holland. He created the name, the little brown jug. And when this first game of the little brown jug started in 1958, when Ryan opened up, William E. Miller won 58, 59, 59, 60, and 61. And then in 1962, Ryan took over. From 62, 63, 64, 65, it was all James G. Ryan and the Cubs. But the beginning of it, the Little Brown Jug, it started with the Miller Falcons. They won the first four of the Little Brown Jug. So the Little Brown Jug stayed over there at William E. Miller up until the year of 1962. And at the end of 1962, the Little Brown Jug left over on Cleburne and went over there at 2610 Elgin. And my whole time over at William E. Miller, I never seen the Little Brown Jug until I went to 2610 Elgin, where James G. Ryan was. But that's the history of the Little Brown Jug in 3rd Ward. It was a rivalry between two 3rd Ward junior high schools. William E. Miller, the Falcons, James G. Ryan, the Cubs. And I want to thank you guys for all your support, and most of all, I want to thank all the Jack Yates linemen who came and contributed to help put the broadcast of the Jack Yates Men Luncheon together. Thank you guys, thank you, thank you, thank you. And we'll see you at the next Jack Yates Men Luncheon, June the 11th, 2022. That's July, y'all. Now, not June, that's July. So, July the 11th, 2022, the next Jack Yates Men Luncheon.